So I'm sorry, today we're going to be getting into day 5 and a little bit of day 6 because they kind of go hand in hand. So first we'll start off and with when God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that has life and found that may fly above the earth and open in the firmament of heaven. And God created a great whale. Well, God created great whales and every living creature that moveth, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind, and God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the fowl multiply on the earth. And the evening and the morning were the 5th day. And God said, Let the earth bring forth a living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, the beasts of the earth after his kind. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth and after his kind, and the cattle and around the kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God said, Let us make a man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creep upon the earth. So God created man in his own image, and in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. And God blessed them. God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth, and subdue it, and have
YouTubers and
YouTube links,
fish
and
of
your
the sea,
and over the fowl of the earth, and over every living thing. Ministries. And today we're going to be getting into day upon the earth
of the Bible.
And God said, Behold, I have given unto you every green seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in which the fruit of the tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat, and every beast of the earth, and every fowl of the air, and every living thing that creepeth upon the earth, wherein is life, I have given unto thee green herb for meat. And it was so. And God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day. Now this is covering a giant chunk of stuff, but we're really going to focus, at least on this video, from there pretty much up into here. God creates the fishies, he makes the birdies, he makes the cows and the doggies, all that stuff. So first what we have to talk about before we talk about anything else is, because this pretty much breaks down into evolution, because man was also made on this day. The Christian worldview obviously says that God made these things in each specific day. Well, what is a day? What is a day in the time of God? I don't know. The only reference I have is that this is a 24-hour day. I'm going to assume it was the way then, but that isn't actually the case. But it makes no real difference. God made them in the sequence. This is the sequence he made them. But it is not theistic evolution saying that God made the circumstances for which evolution would become. Theistic evolution says that, well, God started off with monkeys and they eventually became man. That is absolutely wrong in many different ways, because then we're not saying that man is made in the image of God, like what it says right there. But this is what we're going to get into a little bit later. So we have what is the idea of evolution. Before we get into it, we'll actually get into the definition right now. See, evolution. The Merriam-Webster definition, the day-to-day versions that we deal with. Descent with modifications from pre-existing species, cumulative inherited change of a population of organisms through time, leading to the appearance of new forms, the process by which new species or populations of living things develop from pre-existing forms through successive generations. And this is what we normally deal with or think about when we think about evolution, but it doesn't explain the origin. See, evolution here is one form into a new form, but it does not give you the origin of where those forms come from, where the matter, material, information, energy, all that stuff. All it directly tells you is that, well, we have one kind of monkey and it's going to become another kind of monkey. But this is just what we consider to be the general definition of evolution. But what is the actual, let's say, definition of evolution? Well, in our lovely little textbook we have here, as you can see on the side, Strickberg's Evolution. This is an entire book dedicated to the ideas and theories of evolution. It gives us a couple interesting things. And here we have where it says the word evolution. The definition above indicates that the word evolution has different meanings, and the concept of evolution applies to a wide variety of human activity, evolution of an argument, evolution of modern day. That's why when I brought up this, Merriam-Webster's definition of evolution, I specifically said this is the one that we normally deal with when we talk about evolution being the theory as it's presented, one form into another form. And here it pretty much kind of goes into the same exact thing, and it talks about the mechanisms by which evolution comes into, like the concept of evolution as a process. Evolution has to be a process that if you add enough time into something, when one form goes into another, it'll have your perfect distinct roots. There's a couple problems with that, though. When we talk about evolution as the process, it is because you can talk about the mechanisms that drive it, such as natural selection and mutations. Because natural selection is the process by which animals feed out what they consider advantageous traits by genetic mutation. So genetic mutation happens based on the need of its environment, and it's passed down to its offsprings. But we're going to get into natural selection. The process of natural selection is defined by Charles Darwin, by modern day people today, or common use of language as Merriam-Webster would put it, a natural process that results in the survival and reproductive success of individuals or groups best adjusted to their environment that leads to the continuation of genetic qualities best suited to a particular environment. Now we can go a step further when it talks about the units of selection. This is the Department of Biology, University of Chicago. The principle of natural selection as the motive force for evolution was framed by Charles Darwin as the struggle for existence on the part of the organism living into a finite, risky environment, and that it comes down to three basic necessities: that different individuals and populations have different morphologies, physiologies, and behaviors, phenotype variations, and that these different phenotypes have different rates of survival, and reproduction in different environments, different kinds of fitnesses. And there's a correlation between the parents and the offspring in the contribution of each of these future generations, fitness and heredity. Well, this is all true to a degree. See, as we see before, it talks about natural selection, a process that results in survival of reproductive processes, groups adjusted to their environment. And then this, where it says different individuals and different populations, different morphologies. Well, they both have the same kind of feel to them, but they're quite different in nature. Because when you start talking about different morphologies, physiologies, well, it still discusses this is a species. This is the genetic information that exists within the species to create the variations or different kinds that we see. There are black dogs, there are blue dogs. Potentially blue dogs, anyway, or dogs that appear to be blue, that are gray. There are big dogs, small dogs. There are big cats, small cats. A tiger is a type of cat. They are part of the same genus, but that's more the taxonomic systems that we'll get into in just a moment. Here is what I'm getting at, is that the units of selection is that based on a specific population of a family or a genus, which again we'll get into. So just think about this as all the same types of animals. See, all these are dogs. They all have different characteristics, and it would increase the variations that can be produced from them. Follow? And that the populations that come from them are from the existing parents. But natural selection happens by processes of mutation. Mutations, now this definition here, a relatively permanent change in heredity materials that involves either a change in chromosome structure, a change in sequence of genes, gene codons, and the errors of germ cells and somatic cells, with those germ cells being capable of continuing, or sexual reproduction. This, through translocations, deletions, duplications, these are all things that are relatively negative, and that there's a frame shift or a error in gene coding. That is what we understand it. This is Merriam-Webster defines everything as basic English. This is what we understand as basic English. An error happens somewhere. The error produces a loss of genetic information, We consider it to be natural selection as it's weeding itself out. But this loss of genetic information produces traits that would be more advantageous to an environment, even though those traits or information that it would be missing would actually be detrimental to its own health. Even if it were to shift between environments, or that the information is given in that environment to give it a specific trait, that trait is not necessarily beneficial. We'll get to that in a moment. This is what CUNY University of Brooklyn, or community college. CUNY University is a collection of colleges in Brooklyn, but this is what they basically teach across colleges throughout the entire United States. A mutation occurs when a DNA gene is damaged or changed in such a way as to alter the genetic message carried by that gene. So, mom has XX, dad has XY, every baby starts off XX, and something happens along the way. Going from male to female or female to male is not a mutation. A mutation would be more along like sickle cell anemia being a mutation in cells and that dying off within a population. Or at least a disease that is carried genetically. But that's more of a topic for another time, because there's specific circumstances that are very special, not necessarily to that disease, but it's more of a manufactured cause. That's why it still exists today and why the populations themselves haven't quite died off yet. But mutations are losses of genetic information that do not actually help in the means of natural selection. And natural selection, although it does happen, in the sense that within the gene pools that exist within all animals, for instance, we'll say dogs, every size, appearance is within the gene pool of every dog, and within it their parents, and within their parents' parents. It just so happens that there are carriers for all of those things because they came from a common ancestor, which is what evolution says, that everything originates somewhere, but it does not give you the explanation for the origin. We'll get to that in a moment. So you start off with one big dog, and you can produce much smaller dogs based on the environment, the amount of food, how big it can grow, and stuff like that. But as most studies show, 70% of all kinds of gene mutations are inherently dangerous to the host or the subsequent generations. It's only a very small population that would ever have any kind of true benefits from something like this. Now, although most of these things are true, one species does develop into another based on environmental changes, not necessarily mutations. Mutations are not good in any kind of way. But where it breaks down here is that it cannot explain the origins of life, whereas here it specifically says, and God said, let the water, and God said, and God made, and God created whales, and every living creature that moves, bring forth abundantly, and he saw that it was good. In these verses it says that God made everything. Because if you take evolution all the way back to the theory of the present, you either say that A, everything came from a rock, and that rocks or hydrogen, somehow hydrogen managed to fuse with itself to produce every other kind of basic element and mineral by happen chance, and that each one of these things perfectly aligned to create the very first cellular organisms. Each one of these cellular organisms merge and create multicellular organisms that somehow divide amongst themselves, even though the original components that comprise them, prokaryotes, eukaryotes. A eukaryote is something that is a single cellular organism. Prokaryote is something of multicellular origin. And they say that all prokaryotes came from eukaryotes, that eukaryotes somehow merged and thought it was more advantageous to be that way, and they figured out a way to divide individually, and that the DNA sequence for each individual cell, but that's getting into a lot of stuff. Point being is that somehow, by some means, everything works out fantastically, and that rocks become people, even though you don't see that today in anything, and which leads me to the second point. is that you have a taxonomic systems. You know, what animals are actually animals? Because as we were talking about before, you know, here in evolution, you have to be a specific species and a pre-existing species, and you can only mate within your families and within your genus. It's very rare that you ever have anything of different genuses mating, but they are of the same kind. See, when God says, bring forth living creatures after his kind, these is what we would consider part of the traditional taxonomic system of King Philip came over from Germany sailing. You know, kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species. And the International Commission of Zoological Nomenclature puts this very perfectly. How things are named, and what is the actual groups and subgroups of this, the naming of individual things that are animals as well as biological. There's an International Commission of Biological Nomenclature. It's all really relative. But things of the same genus is where things start breaking down, because, see, cats and dogs are the same family, but they are not of the same genus. They cannot mate. But there are some rare exceptions of things that are of different genus, like the king snake and the corn snake. But they're both snakes. They're the same kind of animal. So they're going to produce an offspring that is of the same kind. You do not have cats and dogs mating. Cats and dogs are different. They're inherently different. But this brings me to my next point of, as we were talking about the taxonomic classifications, well, they want to start reclassifying a lot of the stuff based on genes instead of by traits. So because taxonomic classifications based on physiology, morphologies, you know, skeletal structures, the way something appears. You know what a cat looks like, and all cats are going to be of the same kind of family, and they're going to work its way down to its species, and each species is a little bit different. It's kind of unspecific about the name of that, whatever it's going to be at the very bottom. But you know, if you trace its way back up, its characteristics are similar. As you go further and further up the chains, you get, you know, the animal kingdom. All animals are animals, and they have these physical features like vertebrates and invertebrates. So you have genetic genes looking not just on a very bacterial level, but they really want to start pushing for everything that is prokaryotic. So not just things that are unicellular, but multicellular, things that have many cells, things that have DNA that can reproduce itself, you know, RNA strands, basically us. We are prokaryotic creatures, if you want to think about it that way. But they're looking more at the individual cell, but they're also looking upwards towards animals. I know there's been a couple examples of animals being found in the wild, and taking blood samples from them, and that their genes are showing some very interesting things that aren't necessarily common in today's world. Like things of different, not necessarily a genus, but different species that were intermarrying that couldn't have been related, but that's because they were splicing genes, and we'll get to that in a moment. With the advent of gene splicing, though, gene splicing being you're taking a specific DNA sample, and you're putting or inserting something else in. For instance, I can take the goat and insert spider DNA so that it produces biosteel. See, there was a U.S., I forget whether or not it was a U.S. company or international company that wanted to start patenting a biosteel that was produced from genetically altered goats, that steel with the tensile strength of spider silk, because it is the strongest substance per its material, like a spider web, could easily catch a plane if it was big enough. And so they genetically altered the goat to produce that silk. And that's where you start getting, well, they're not even of the same genus, they're not even really of the same family. How on earth is this happening? Well, if you change the taxonomic system to something like this, where you're basing on genes and DNA, then with the advent of splicing is the way it is, you work your way backwards and say, well, God can't exist because so-and-so and so-and-so. You know, what do you mean? We have these half monkey, half Canadian bear, half bull moose creatures out there. You know, man bear pig is out there, people. We need to stop man bear pig. And if man bear pig exists, then that means when God said of these kinds, it wouldn't matter. Because God specifically says after his kind, after their kind, these kinds of animals, and there is no interbreeding. Gene splicing stops that. It no longer has that barrier. It was naturally put there, and we are unnaturally going about removing it. No different than chimeras. Chimeras are half human, half animal hybrids. Now here we have at the MIT's technology review. They are trying to ban, braving a funding ban put in place by America's top health agencies. Some U.S. research centers are moving ahead with attempting to grow human tissue inside of pigs and sheep with the goal of creating hearts, livers, and other organs needed for transplant. This is not the case whatsoever. They are trying to make a perfect human specimen, and this is how they're testing it. How can you make a human as strong as a gorilla and as fast as a cheetah? Stuff like that. This is how you start off, and you always say it's for good causes. Like organs needed for transplants. You always put a good cause in there somewhere. Otherwise, it does not work. And my perfect example when discussing this stuff is the bioinfo microsciences project invested in development. This paragraph I'm going to be reading. And developed the intersections of biology, information technology, microphysical systems, and to exploit important technological advances and to leverage fundamental discoveries for the development of new technologies, techniques, and systems of interest to the Department of Defense. This research is critical to the development of improved training and cognitive rehabilitation. Programs in this project draw upon the information and physical sciences to discover properties of biological systems that cross multiple scales of biological architecture and function, from the molecular to genetic levels through cellular tissue, organ, and whole organism levels. This project developed the basic research tools for biology and unique applications of biological-based solutions to critical defense problems. Well, what kind of problems does the Department of Defense actually have that would actually need or require going to a molecular and genetic level of researching human beings? Now, there's a whole bunch in this appropriations and budget for the fiscal year of 2018, and I'll actually scroll right there. Department of Defense fiscal year budget for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA. When people talk about DARPA, they're creating chimera hybrids. They're the ones that are actually funding that research. They're the ones making it happen, and they're succeeding. The whole idea of the Halo Wars are extremely real. Partially biological cyborgs that can walk around the earth and do whatever they want. But that's a biblical scale of a different time. Here, though, back to the conversation at hand, you change the classification system. You start making half-human hybrids, and you start playing God inherently. Because when you look back, then you say, well, God can't exist, but he absolutely does. And one of the best ways to merge both of these ideas, when you talk about evolution crossing borders as a whole, and when you talk about the taxonomic system, is the studies about what is the point that limits variation. You see, in Princeton University, a study of Darwin's finches reveals that species can be developed in as little as 2 generations. You see, there's been tons of studies about this, that within a gene pool, regardless if you introduce a new species, if they are of the same kind of animal, within 3 generations, you will see the max variations that exist within that gene pool. There's a limit. And with both of these things, those limits are being broken by humans. But inherently, what exists within any kind, things that are of not the same kind cannot make things that are not the same genus in our current taxonomic system. But in terms of God's taxonomic system, things of different kinds cannot mate. You splice them together, then they can, and you work your way forward. And if they can mate, it all goes backwards instead of forwards. But there's also more interesting things when you think about, because it also says here, on the 5th day, God makes all the things that bring forth the living creatures after his kind, cattle, creeping thing, beasts of the earth after his kind. And this is what I always like getting into, because when they talk about that, I'm not going to bring up the extra biblical or other biblical references that talk about dinosaurs, but this is a perfect case. But I'll actually get to that in just a minute. First, I'd like to get into bridging backwards. So you change the taxonomic system, and you can clearly see that the structures of finches, as well as many other kinds of species, there is a limit to the amount of genetic variation that exists in the subsequent generations. So you see that there's a limit to this concept here, evolution. Modifications from pre-existing species. Within 3 generations, you're going to have a max pool in population, which is here, that these populations, by definition, okay, the populations have different morphologies, well, it's going to max out. So you have all of that, and then so, well, if that's the case, then it can't really reproduce itself into the same kind. This is where you get into the fossil records and dinosaurs. See, because Darwin's evidence for evolution, this is NY, New York University, this is what they use when they teach. And I will admit that despite Darwin's arguments that fossil record is likely to be poor and biased sampling of historical events leading to the origin of evolution of the species, he nevertheless goes on to show how it is consistent with branching evolution. Going back this way to our finches, everything of the same kind, just because a bird is a bird, doesn't make a difference. When it goes outward, and it supposedly branches, it's not really branching anywhere. It is always producing something of similar species. It says, new species have appeared gradually, and that's true, but you don't see different kinds of animals being produced spontaneously. You don't even see different kinds of animals being able to mate. But in that fossil record that it talks about, where it's a biased sampling of historical events, what's usually used is things like vestigial structures. Vestigial structures is an organism that has lost most of its original function in the course of evolution, such as a human appendix. However, there is no such thing as vestigial structures, like a whale's. I'm not going to pull it up right now, but whales have a back tail that are actually used to help mating. They're considered the vestigial legs when they try to walk on land and couldn't because it was too big. Or the appendix for humans, well, the appendix for humans works as a immune support system. It takes in minerals. You know, most people who get it removed end up getting really sick, prone to infections, liver disease, things like that. There is no thing as vestigial, and the fossil records, which we're not going to, fossil records themselves are actually a poor based sampling of historical events. Because you have the layers of fossils that, well, the oldest ones are on the bottom, the newest ones are on the top, and there's no new fossils being made. And the problem with a lot of that fossil record stuff is that it's always, and this is more of a flood conversation than anything else, but that they're always dated in between each other. There's organisms that are between the fossil layers, and there's things that are supposed to be dating before. It's a whole bunch of circular reasoning when you talk about dating of fossils. But the interesting thing is that you can always date organic material. Dating a fossil is no different than dating a rock. And when I say that, things like this, he brings forth this kind to talk about dinosaurs. We have soft tissue vessels, cellular preservation, in the T-Rex. See, our lovely group of researchers have found out that if you put a little bit of hydrochloric acid on any kind of fossil, what you're going to find is preserved soft tissues. Now, in this T-Rex, the same one that they're sampling, they did further research on, and they showed that there's a presence of protein, there's presence of blood cells, there's presence of a whole bunch of things. And on dating of that with mass spectroscopy, because you can date organic material very, very accurately, and not so much inorganic material like a rock, puts them at about 50,000 years. 50,000 to 100,000 years. Now, this goes back to our lovely Bible verses. Man would have walked with dinosaurs. God said so when God made Adam. There's not a problem with any of that stuff. Also even in Texas, there's fossilized dinosaur footprints walking across humans. Evolution does not happen in the sense of molecule to man. Evolution happens in micro steps. The problems with definitions, like just how I showed you definitions before, common definitions versus scientific definitions. Everything changed based on the way you're looking at it. But if you branch it all, and and you're looking at it from a higher scope, you're not going to see any real issues, because this is the way God said and God made it. So there's really no problems whatsoever. Dinosaurs work with people. When you start splicing genes together, it goes more into that revelation stuff that we'll get into in a different topic. And that our government, the United States government, as well as the governments of the world, are absolutely evil, and they're trying to make chimeras. And I'll leave you with that topic, and thank you for tuning in.